The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the desk cracked like a gunshot in Nicholas Carter's ears. He didn't flinch. His jaw was locked, his body rigid as the reality sank in. Betrayed, ruined, humiliated. Everything he had built was gone. His attorneys whispered about appeals, but he already knew this was over. Walking out of the courtroom, he was met with flashing cameras and shouting reporters, their voices blending into white noise. Nicholas Carter, do you have any comment on... The fraud charges? Fraud, the word made his stomach churn, like he was the criminal, when in reality he had been stabbed in the back by the one person he trusted most. His grip on the car keys tightened as he stormed toward the parking lot, ignoring the chaos behind him. The moment he got into his car, he slammed the door shut and exhaled a sharp breath. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his bank account balance, 0.00A slow. Burning rage crawled up his spine. He had lost everything. His penthouse, his status, his entire fortune vanished overnight. And now, for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. Nicholas drove with no destination in mind. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, his knuckles turned white. Who could he turn to? His so-called friends? The ones who had enjoyed his luxury, his private jets, his exclusive parties. They had all disappeared the second he lost it all. Only one person remained, the only one who had ever been real. Madeline. Her name hit him like a punch to the chest. 5 years, 5 long years since he had walked away, convinced that love was a distraction, an inconvenience for men like him. He had everything back then. Now he had nothing. He pulled up an old address in his phone. She still lived there. She never left. Without a second thought, he made a U-turn and pressed his foot on the gas. As he pulled up to the house, a flicker of light in the window caught his attention. A shadow moved inside. He stepped out of the car, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was. Madeline. The impact was instant. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. Soft waves of chestnut hair, full lips slightly parted in shock, and those same hazel eyes that had once held all his secrets. Her gaze flickered over him. The creased suit, the undone tie, the exhaustion etched into his features. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the instinct to care, and the instinct to protect herself. Nicholas? Her voice, soft, disbelieving, was a gut punch. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another figure appeared behind her. Tall, broad shoulders, possessive. The man's sharp gaze swept over him like an assessment. Nicholas felt something dark coil in his chest. Then the man turned to Madeline, his voice firm. "Who is this?" Madeline hesitated. Nicholas knew exactly why. Even after all these years, the fire between them wasn't gone. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Nicholas didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes were locked on the man standing next to Madeline, tall, confident, claiming his space. Nicholas felt something cold and sharp curl in his chest. Madeline inhaled, as if trying to steady herself before finally speaking. "This is Ryan. Ryan." Nicholas barely held back a smirk. So that was his replacement. Ryan crossed his arms over his chest, assessing him, testing him. "And who are you?" Nicholas saw the flicker of panic in Madeline's eyes. He could have played nice. He could have walked away, but he wasn't in the mood for games. He met Ryan's stare, his voice smooth and sharp. "I'm her past." Then, with a slow smirk, he added, "And maybe her future." A muscle in Ryan's jaw twitched. "Good." Madeline exhaled sharply, a mixture of frustration and something else flashing in her eyes. "Nicholas, why are you here?" He turned his attention back to her, and suddenly, everything else disappeared. 5 years had passed. But looking at her now, he felt the same pull, the same damn fire that had never gone out. Her hair was slightly messy, her skin glowing in the dim light. She was barefoot, wearing a simple dress that hugged her in all the right places. And damn if he didn't want to pull her close, just to see if she still fit against him the way she used to. He stepped forward, voice low. "I need to talk to you alone." Madeline tensed. "I don't think that's a good idea." Ryan moved closer, his stance protective, possessive. "I agree." Nicholas didn't even look at him. Ryan wasn't the one making the decision here. It was always going to be her, and Nicholas knew exactly what was going through her mind. He saw it in the way she avoided his gaze, the way her fingers clenched into fists like she was trying to stop herself from reaching for him. She was fighting something. Something Nicholas wasn't going to let her win. "This isn't up for discussion, Madeline." His voice dropped lower just for her. "You and I both know it." She sucked in a breath, and for a split second, he saw the hesitation break. Ryan's hand rested on her lower back, and that was Nicholas's last straw. He forced himself to step back, letting the moment linger just enough to make her feel the loss of his presence. Then, with a slow smirk, he said, "I'll be back tomorrow." And then he walked away, because he already knew she wouldn't be able to stop thinking about him tonight, and neither would he. Nicholas barely slept. Madeline was in his head. The taste of her name on his tongue, the way her body had tensed when he stood close like she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. And that man, Ryan. The thought of him touching her, kissing her, sleeping next to her. Nicholas clenched. His jaw. But Ryan wasn't the problem. Madeline was, because she still looked at him like she remembered exactly how it felt to be his, and that meant Nicholas wasn't done with her. Not even close. So the next evening he went back. Without calling, without waiting, he never asked for permission. This time when the door opened, it wasn't Madeline standing there. It was a child. Nicholas froze. A boy, no older than 5, stood in front of him, gripping a toy car in his small hands. Light brown hair, sharp, familiar eyes. Nicholas felt something twist deep in his gut. The boy blinked up at him, head tilting slightly. "Who are you?" Nicholas's throat went dry. Something about this kid felt off, too familiar, too close. Before he could answer, Madeline's voice cut through the air. "Lucas, go inside." Nicholas watched as the boy huffed but obeyed, disappearing back into the house. His body tensed, every muscle coiled with an instinct he didn't understand yet. He turned to Madeline. "Who is that kid?" Her shoulders stiffened. "My son." Nicholas felt the air rip from his lungs. "Son." He took a step forward, voice dangerously quiet. "How old is he?" Madeline hesitated. It was all the confirmation he needed. His mind raced. 5 years. Lucas looked 5. The moment stretched between them, tight with electricity. Nicholas's voice dropped lower, rougher. "Is he mine?" Madeline's lips parted. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Nicholas already knew. Nicholas felt his pulse pound in his ears. His breath was sharp, uneven, as the reality of what he'd just learned sank in. A son. His son. Madeline stood in front of him, lips pressed together, her arms crossed as if shielding herself from his fury. "You lied to me." Her head snapped up, eyes flashing. "I didn't lie. I never told you." His chest tightened with rage. "That's the same damn thing." She flinched, but Nicholas didn't care. 5 years. 5 years of his child's life, stolen from him, his hands curled into fists. The betrayal burned hotter than anything he'd ever felt. Why? His voice was low, controlled, but the edge of something darker lurked beneath it. Madeline looked away, swallowing hard. "Because you didn't want this, Nicholas. You never wanted a family, you said it yourself." His stomach twisted. He had said that once, he had believed it. Madeline exhaled, her voice softer now. "You would have walked away, just like you did back then." Nicholas stiffened. She wasn't wrong. Back then he'd been too caught up in building his empire, too selfish to consider anything beyond his ambition. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that he had a son, and Madeline had taken that choice away from him. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. "You don't get to decide what I would have done." She held her ground, but he saw the way her fingers clenched at her sides, the way her breathing hitched. She was nervous, not just because of his anger, because of something deeper, because even now, standing inches apart, the fire between them still burned. Nicholas reached out, fingers grazing the curve of her jaw. She gasped softly, eyes flickering up to his. "You stole 5 years from me." His voice was low, intimate, dangerous. Madeline's lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't, because she knew he was right and because her body still reacted to him. No matter how much she tried to fight it. Nicholas leaned in so close that his breath ghosted against her lips. "Do you really think this changes anything?" Madeline swallowed hard, her resolve visibly cracking. "Nicholas." He ran his thumb lightly over her lower lip, watching as her eyes fluttered closed for a second. "This isn't over, Madeline." His voice was a promise, and they both knew he never made promises he didn't intend to keep. Madeline's breath hitched. Nicholas was too close, too intense, too much. Her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch, her skin burning where his fingers traced the curve of her jaw. It was always like this with him. Dangerous, overwhelming, impossible to resist. "You stole 5 years from me." His voice was low, rough, almost a growl. Her stomach twisted with guilt. Nicholas's thumb brushed her lower lip, his blue eyes dark with something she didn't want to name. "Do you really think this changes anything?" Madeline forced herself to pull away. She turned her back to him, arms wrapped around her own waist, as if that could protect her from the storm inside her. "What do you want me to say, Nicholas?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his. "Son, I want the truth." She spun to face him. The truth is you would have walked away. You said it yourself. Kids were an anchor." The words hit him like a punch because he had said that, but it didn't matter, not now. "You didn't even give me the chance." Madeline's throat worked around a lump. Nicholas took a step closer. "You made that choice for me." She shook her head, frustration and something deeper flashing in her eyes. "And what? Now you suddenly care? Now you want to be a father?" The words cut him deep, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he grabbed her wrist, not rough but firm, demanding her full attention. "I don't run from what's mine, Madeline." She sucked in a breath, because that wasn't just about Lucas, it was about her too. Nicholas pulled her closer. The air between them charged, electric. "And you're mine." Madeline shivered, even as she fought it. His hand slid to her waist, his fingers pressing into her skin, his scent, clean, masculine, intoxicating, filling her lungs. "Tell me I don't still own every inch of you." His lips hovered just above hers, teasing, taunting. Madeline's pulse thundered in her ears. She should push him away. She should run. But when his lips finally crushed against hers, she didn't resist. The kiss was hot, deep, claiming. His hands gripped her tighter, molding her to him, forcing her to remember exactly how it felt to be his. She moaned into his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. It was madness. It was inevitable. But then, she tore herself away, breathless, shaken. Her lips were swollen, her body still burning for him, but her eyes were full of something Nicholas hadn't expected. Pain. "This doesn't change anything, Nicholas." Her voice was barely a whisper, and before he could stop her, before he could pull her back into his arms where she belonged, she was gone. Nicholas sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart was still hammering in his chest, his lips still tingling with the taste of her. Madeline had kissed him back. She wanted him, but she had also walked away, and that was what burned the most. He slammed his palm against the dashboard, frustration curling through his veins. What the hell was he supposed to do now? A son. He had a son. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. Nicholas Carter was not meant to be a father. He had never imagined himself in that role, had never even considered it. And yet, now that he knew, he couldn't. "Stop thinking about it, Lucas." The boy had his eyes, his blood, his name. Nicholas clenched his jaw. How the hell was he supposed to just accept that 5 years had been stolen from him? That he had missed everything? His son's first steps, his first words, his first laugh. And for what? Because Madeline thought he wouldn't have wanted him. The anger boiled hotter. She had made that decision alone. She had taken that choice away from him, and Nicholas never let anyone take anything from him. He grabbed his phone and dialed the only number that mattered right now. Carter. The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "I need the best family lawyer you can find, someone who specializes in custody." A brief silence. "Are you sure you want to go down that road?" Nicholas's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't lose what's mine." His voice was deadly calm. Lucas was his, and now so was this fight. Madeline stood in her kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her breath still uneven, shaky. She could still feel him. The taste of Nicholas lingered on her lips. The heat of his hands still burned on her skin, and it terrified her because she had kissed him back. She had melted into him like she had 5 years ago, like nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Lucas was upstairs, sleeping soundly, unaware that his entire world was about to shift, because Nicholas wasn't going to let this go. A knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart stopped. She didn't need to check. She knew it was him. For a long moment, she considered ignoring it, but she couldn't. She never could. With a deep breath, she walked to the door and pulled it open. Nicholas stood there, his blue eyes locked on hers, dark, intense, filled with something she couldn't name. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. He never waited. She swallowed, hard. "You shouldn't be here." He shut the door behind him, slow, deliberate. "We need to talk." Madeline hugged her arms around herself. "I don't think that's a good idea." Nicholas's gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering. "And yet, you kissed me." Her stomach tightened. "That was a mistake." He took a step closer. "No." His voice was smooth. "Dangerous." "Sure." Another step. That was inevitable. She should have stepped back, but her feet stayed rooted in place. Nicholas reached out, tracing his fingers along her arm, sending a trail of heat up her spine. "Tell me to leave." His voice was a whisper, low and rough. A challenge. Madeline's lips parted. She should have told him to go, but then his hand slid around her waist, pulling her against him, and every coherent thought vanished. His scent wrapped around her, masculine, intoxicating, laced with control. His lips hovered near her ear. "You don't want me to leave." A shiver ran through her because he was right. Madeline's fingers curled into his shirt, fisting the fabric, holding on to him even as her mind screamed to let go. Nicholas didn't give her time to think. His lips crashed onto hers, devouring, claiming, demanding everything she had. The kiss was nothing like the one before. It was hungrier, rawer, fueled by years of denial and tension so thick it was suffocating. He lifted her effortlessly, pressing her against the wall, his body flush against hers. Madeline moaned into his mouth, her hands sliding up his chest, over, his shoulders, nails digging into his skin. Nicholas deepened the kiss, exploring, tasting, breaking every last piece of resistance she had left. And when his lips moved to her neck, when his teeth grazed her pulse, she stopped fighting. She surrendered. Completely. The soft glow of dawn spilled into the room, casting golden light over. Tangled sheets and the two bodies still tangled in them. Madeline stirred, her skin still warm, still tingling from his touch. Every inch of her body ached in the most delicious, sinful way. Nicholas lay beside her, bare-chested, one arm draped over her waist, his breathing deep and even. She turned her head slightly, watching him in the quiet stillness of the morning. How many times had she woken up like this years ago? Back then she thought they were unbreakable, that nothing could pull them apart. But they had broken, and she had spent 5 years piecing herself back together. So why did it feel like, with one night, he had unraveled all of it? Her heart clenched. This wasn't real. Nicholas Carter didn't change. She couldn't afford to fall again. With slow, careful movements, she slipped out from under his arm and reached for the oversized shirt on the floor. His shirt. As soon as the fabric slid over, her bare skin, the scent of him surrounded her, wrapping around her like a second skin. Her fingers tightened on the hem. She needed to leave this room, but before she could take a step, running already. Madeline froze. She turned slowly to find Nicholas watching her, his blue eyes hooded, sharp, unreadable. He propped himself up on one elbow, the sheets slipping lower, revealing the hard lines of his torso. He was too much. Always had been. She swallowed. I just needed some air. Nicholas's gaze dropped to the shirt she wore, his shirt. His lips curled slightly. You sure about that? Heat crept up her neck. Don't start, Nicholas. But he was already pushing himself up. The movement. Slow, deliberate. Start what? He stood, closing the space between them in 2 long strides. She stepped back instinctively, but he followed, crowding her, caging her in. You're the one who let me in again, Maddie. His voice was a whisper, soft but devastating. And now you're running. Madeline's throat tightened. I just need time to think. Nicholas tipped her chin up, forcing her to look at him. You didn't need time last night. A sharp breath left her lips. Because he was right. Nicholas's gaze searched hers, looking for the fight he knew was there. What are you so afraid of? She hated that he could read her so easily. She wanted to push him away, to remind him that he was only here now because he wanted control. But then his fingers slid down her arm, slow and lazy, as if he had all the time in the world. Her pulse skipped. Tell me you don't feel this. The heat in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't lie to him, not when her body had already answered for her, but she could still protect herself. She pulled back, putting distance between them, feeling something isn't enough, Nicholas. For the first time, a flicker of something like frustration crossed his face. She turned before he could say anything else, because if she stayed, she wouldn't leave at all. The night air was thick, pressing against Madeline's skin as she paced the living room. Her thoughts were racing, her heart pounding too fast. She had barely spoken to Nicholas since that morning, since she walked away, but she knew it was only a matter of time. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go, and she was right, because when the knock came at the door, she already knew who it was. Her pulse spiked. For a second, she considered not answering, but she did. The moment she opened the door, Nicholas was there, standing tall, confident, his blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He stepped inside before she could tell him not to. We're not done. Maddie, the way he said her name, low, smooth, dangerous, sent a familiar shiver through her spine. She crossed her arms, trying to build some kind of barrier between them. What do you want me to say, Nicholas? He exhaled sharply. Want you to stop running. Her jaw tightened. I'm not running, He moved closer, crowding her, forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his gaze. You are. You've been running for 5 years. Her stomach twisted. Maybe I had a reason. Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt? Frustration? Possession? Then suddenly, his hands were on her waist, hot, firm, pulling her against him. You think you can erase last night? His voice was a whisper, rough and full of something raw. Madeline's breath caught because his body was pressed against hers, solid and warm. Because his hands were tracing slow, lazy circles on her lower back, like he had every right to touch her because she wanted him to. Tell me you don't want me, Maddie, the way he said it. Taunting, knowing, made her stomach flip. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Nicholas's lips curled slightly, as if he already knew her answer. Then, without hesitation, he kissed her. Hard, deep, fierce. A kiss that demanded everything, and Madeline gave it. Her fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, needing him closer. Her body pressed flush against his, and he groaned low in his throat, deepening the kiss. One hand sliding up her back, tangling in her hair. Everything spun, everything burned, but then, suddenly she jerked back, panting, her lips swollen from his. Nicholas's breathing was rough, his grip still firm on her waist. Her voice was barely a whisper. This doesn't change anything. Nicholas studied her, his gaze dark, unreadable. Then, he took a step back. We'll see about that, and with one last look he walked out the door, leaving Madeline shaken, breathless, and completely, devastatingly ruined. Madeline stood in the kitchen gripping the counter, her breathing still uneven, ragged. Nicholas had kissed her like he was staking a claim, like he was reminding her exactly who she belonged to. And the worst part? She had let him. Her body still burned from his touch, from the way he had pulled her into him like he had every right to. But he didn't. Not anymore. A sudden bang at the front door made her jump. The sound was angry, sharp. Her stomach twisted. Ryan, she barely had time to prepare before he stormed into the house, his face tight with frustration. What the hell is going on, Madeline? Her hands clenched. Ryan, this isn't a good time. Not a good time? You disappear on me for 2 days and then I hear that he's back? Madeline's chest tightened. This isn't your business. Ryan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. I think it is. You're with me. Madeline opened her mouth, but nothing came out because the truth sat like a weight in her chest. Ryan wasn't the man she wanted. He never had been, and the one she did want had just come back to take everything. Ryan exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. So that's it? He shows up, kisses you, and you forget everything. Madeline swallowed hard. This isn't about Nicholas, but it was. Ryan scoffed, stepping closer. He's going to leave you again, Maddie. He's going to destroy you all over again. She flinched. At the truth in his words, Ryan shook his head. And when he does, don't come running back to me. Then he was gone. The door slammed shut, and the house fell into silence. But before she could even take a breath, I see you handled that well. Madeline spun around, her pulse spiking. Nicholas was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, arms crossed, watching her. She sucked in a sharp breath. What the hell, Nicholas? Were you listening? He smirked. Hard not to with all the yelling. She groaned, rubbing a hand over her face. I don't need this right now. He stepped forward, his presence impossible to ignore. Yes, you do, Madeline's heart thundered. Because he was right. She did need him, and that was the problem. Madeline couldn't breathe. Nicholas was too close, too intense, too damn sure of himself. His presence filled the room, the scent of him, clean, warm, undeniably masculine, wrapped around her like a noose. She had just lost Ryan, and yet she didn't feel like she had lost anything at all because Nicholas was still here, and he wasn't backing down. You think you're so damn sure of everything, don't you? Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Nicholas tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto hers. No. His voice was low, rough, honest. But I'm sure about you. Her breath caught. Don't do this. He took another step. Closer. Do what, Madeline? Tell you the truth, that I should have never left, that I never stopped thinking about you. She shook her head. This isn't fair. His jaw clenched, his frustration finally breaking through. What isn't fair? Is that you're still lying to yourself. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Nicholas reached for her. Not roughly. Not like he was demanding, but like he was waiting, daring her to make the next move. Tell me you don't want me. His fingers slid down her arm, a slow, teasing trail of fire. Tell me you don't feel this. Her pulse pounded in her throat. Nicholas's hand wrapped around her waist, pulling her into his heat, his body hard and solid against hers. Her resolve crumbled. She could feel his breath ghosting over her lips, his fingers tightening on her waist like he was seconds away from losing his control. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted him to. You have to prove it, Nicholas. The words slipped from her lips before she could stop them. His expression darkened, and then he kissed her. Not slow, not soft, not gentle. It was fire and desperation. 5 years of longing compressed into a single touch. Nicholas's hands slid down her back, gripping her hips, pulling her tighter against him. Madeline gasped, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. And that was the moment she knew. This wasn't just a mistake. This was everything, and she was done running. Nicholas held her as if she was the only thing that had ever mattered. Madeline felt it in the way his fingers pressed into her waist, firm, unrelenting, in the way his lips moved against hers, hungry, desperate, like he was breathing her in. She had spent so long convincing herself that this wasn't real, that he wasn't real. But this was undeniable. Her body melted into his, the heat between them scorching, addictive. Nicholas pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "Say it, Maddie." Her fingers gripped his shirt. "Say what?" His eyes, dark and filled with something too raw to name, searched hers. "That you're mine." Madeline's heart pounded so hard it drowned out every thought, because deep down she already knew the answer. She always had. Her lips parted, and just before she could speak, a small voice broke through the moment. "Mommy?" Both of them froze. Madeline turned, and there, standing at the edge of the hallway, was Lucas, sleepy, confused, watching them. Nicholas felt his chest tighten, because for the first time he wasn't just looking at a child, he was looking at his son. Madeline's breath shook. This was it, the moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but Nicholas was already moving. He knelt down, his entire body tense, careful, controlled. Lucas blinked up at him. "Hey, buddy." The boy hesitated, and then, in a voice so small it almost shattered Nicholas completely, he whispered, "Are you my dad?" Nicholas felt his throat close. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the boy, cupping his small shoulders, grounding himself. "Yeah." Lucas bit his lip, studying him, considering. And then, just when Nicholas thought his heart couldn't take it anymore, the boy stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Nicholas's neck. Nicholas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He held his son, and for the first time in his life, he finally understood what it meant to have everything. The afternoon sun bathed the backyard in golden light as Lucas ran across the grass, his laughter ringing through the air. Nicholas watched him from the patio, a slow, genuine smile pulling at his lips. His son. The words still felt surreal. A reality he had never imagined for himself, but one he would never trade. Lucas kicked the soccer ball toward him with as much force as his small legs could muster. "Bet you can't stop me, Dad." Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest at the word Dad. He smirked, stepping forward. "Oh, I don't know, buddy. I used to be pretty good at this." Lucas narrowed his eyes, determined. "We'll see about that." Madeline laughed from where she sat on the porch, watching them. Nicholas turned to her, and everything in his world felt exactly as it should be. She had finally stopped running, and he had finally learned what it meant to fight for something that mattered. Nicholas caught the ball effortlessly, lifting it into the air. Lucas groaned. "No fair." Nicholas chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. Madeline walked toward them, arms crossed, a teasing smirk on her lips. "Are you bullying our son already?" Nicholas wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close, just toughening him up. She rolled her eyes, but the affection was clear in the way she leaned into him. Nicholas tilted his head down, brushing his lips over hers in a slow, lingering kiss. Lucas groaned dramatically. Do you guys have to do that?" Madeline laughed against Nicholas's mouth. "Get used to it, kid." Nicholas glanced at his son, then at the woman who had changed everything for him. His empire had fallen once. But this was the only thing that ever really mattered, and he'd never let it go. Not again, not ever. Sometimes life has a way of taking everything away just to show us what truly matters. Nicholas spent years believing success was his only purpose. That love was a distraction. That family wasn't for men like him. But what good is having everything if you're empty inside? Madeline learned to protect herself, to build walls so high that even the man she once loved couldn't reach her again. But can we ever really outrun the people who are meant to be in our lives? And Lucas, he got what he had always deserved, a key. Father who finally chose to fight for him. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but when it does, do we have the courage to take them? Now it's your turn to ask yourself, have you ever walked away from something thinking it was the right decision, only to wonder later if you made the biggest mistake of your life? Would you have done what Nicholas did? Would you have forgiven, like Madeline did? Or would you have missed your chance? Would you have forgiven Nicholas? Do you think Madeline made the right choice? If you were in Nicholas's place, Would you fight to be in your child's life no matter what? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your opinions help shape the next stories. And if this story made your heart race, share it with someone who loves a good second chance romance.